As Mike said, my name is Konstanze Kunst, and I am the Joseph and Seal Maser Librarian for Jewish Studies at Yale University Library for a little over 3 years now. 21 months ago, in February 2023, my colleague Stephen Naron, the director of the Fortunoff Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, invited me to work with him on an exhibit to mark the 45th anniversary of the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies. Another reason for creating this exhibit was and is the rapidly approaching end of living testimony. This year, a person who survived the Holocaust was able to come to our opening event and recite 2 of her poems. Who knows whether this will still be possible for the 50th anniversary? It took nearly 16 months to put together the exhibit, which presents excerpts from 19 survivor and witness testimonies, together with 149 items from the collections of Yale University Library. It cannot go without saying that next to Stephen and me, numerous people in and also outside Yale Library worked on this exhibit and brought it into being. An exhibit such as this is always the product of close collaboration, shared expertise, and graciousness. I wish I had the time to tell you about all the colleagues and friends who contributed to this exhibit. Now, as many of you might know, the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies emerged from the Holocaust Survivors Film Project, a grassroots organization of survivors and their allies. The Holocaust Survivors Film Project emerged in New Haven in 1979 when Laurel Block, a local television producer, and Dr. Dori Laub, a psychiatrist and child survivor, began recording survivor testimonies on videotape. Initially, the goal was to produce a documentary film. After their first taping session, Block and Laub realized that the significance of this effort would extend beyond a single film. Together with the survivors, William Rosenberg and Geoffrey Hartman, a professor for literature at Yale, they founded the Holocaust Survivors Film Project. The project evolved into the first and longest operating organization of its kind to conduct extended interviews with survivors and witnesses of Nazi persecution on videotape. Excerpts from the first 4 interviews and their physical tapes can be seen in the exhibit, as well as documents from the early history of the Holocaust Survivors Film Project, such as this newspaper clipping from 1980. The project posted calls like this in the local newspapers and the Jewish press, yet word of mouth was the primary way news of the project spread through the local survivor community. In 1981, the first tapes were deposited to Yale Library, and in 1982, the Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies was inaugurated. You can see excerpts from the inauguration ceremony, including an excerpt of Elie Wiesel's powerful speech in the first video vitrine in the exhibit. In 1987, a gift from Alan Fortunoff was announced to support the archive's endowment, and the collection was later renamed in his recognition. From a small collection of 183 testimonies, the Fortunoff Archive grew into a collection of over 4,000 interviews that can be accessed in digitized form from 223 access sites in 32 countries on 6 continents, and they are still recording. Now, before I talk about some more items in the exhibit, which hopefully prompt you to visit it for the first time, or maybe even a second time, I wanted to talk a little bit about the organization of the video vitrines on the mezzanine and the excerpts shown there to help you a little with your wayfinding when you visit us. If you enter the Beinecke through its revolving door and want to go straight to the beginning of the video exhibit, take the stairs to your left, which lead you directly to this big vitrine. It mostly contains materials highlighting some of the activities of the Fortunoff Archive during its 45th five-year-long history. The round case also shows photographs of some of the survivors whose testimonies are shown in the exhibit. The photographs were taken either before or after the Holocaust. They reflect the approach of the Fortunoff Archive to invite survivors to share their complete life stories, rather than limiting testimonies to traumatic events. The middle of the case shows a poster which was created by the survivor Pinchas Schwarz in 1947 for a competition organized by the Central Historical Commission of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews and the American Zone of Occupation in Germany, an organization about which I will talk soon. Pinchas Schwarz poster won first place. It calls to us in Yiddish, helft schreiben die Geschichte von letzten Churben. In English, help to write the history of the last destruction, that is the Holocaust. If you look to the right of this vitrine, you see the main introductory text of the exhibit that marks the beginning of the video excerpt display. The first video shows, as already mentioned, excerpts from the inauguration of the archive in 1982. It is followed by 8 more vitrines which all show excerpts from survivor testimonies. These excerpts highlight some themes of the Holocaust and the atrocities committed by the Germans and their collaborators, like the horrible condition in ghettos, concentration and death camps, life in hiding, resistance, and the genocide of the Romani people. On the Romani people. In one video vitrine, 3 songs from survivor testimonies are presented. The Jews who documented the Holocaust while it was still ongoing and directly after the war considered the collection of songs, poems, idioms, and language as essential to their project. The Fortunoff Archive follows this tradition. If you look for it, you will see that songs and poems as testimony are one of the red threads which go through the whole exhibit. Now, over the past 50 years, an archetype of the Holocaust survivor has emerged that often has little in common with the individual persons themselves. The 4,400 interviews that are in the collection of the Fortunoff Archive counteract any generalizations. They reveal a true polyphony of experiences and ideas, confirming thus what the great scholar of Holocaust testimony, Lawrence Langer, Zichrono Livracha, who conducted interviews for the Fortunoff Archive and was one of its greatest supporters, wrote in one of his last publications before his passing. Maybe plural pronouns like we or they should be banned from Holocaust discourse, since on the evidence of the hundreds of interviews I have done or see, the differences among the narrated ordeals of death and survival far outnumber the similarities. Stephen and I tried our best to avoid the pitfall of generalizations and to express at least small fragments of the great diversity in the Fortunoff Archive's collections. Moreover, even though this exhibition primarily focuses on Jewish victims and Jewish practices of documenting anti-Jewish violence, It also aims to provide a space for remembering the millions of non-Jewish victims of National Socialism. Thus, visitors encounter also an excerpt of the Romani survivor Christina Gill. And if you go to the vitrines on the other side of the mezzanine, passing this case, you will encounter excerpts from 9 more testimonies, beginning with that of Jan Karski, who was part of the Polish underground resistance and risked his life to sneak into ghettos and camps to gather information on the fate of Polish Jewry, which he sent or reported in person to the Allies in London and the United States. Jan Karski was a non-Jew. The following 8 video vitrines are all dedicated to testimonies about liberation and the life thereafter. They include an excerpt from the interview with Leon Bass, a Black soldier who, after volunteering at the age of 18, was forced to serve in a segregated unit, which also was sent to Buchenwald for relief work shortly after its liberation. Nobody prepared the unit what they would encounter. After the war, Bass shared his experiences as an educator and civil rights activist, both in the classroom and beyond. It was important for Stephen and me to choose excerpts that challenged the naive idea of a full liberation, and that stressed that the Holocaust and all crimes committed by the Germans and their collaborators are still an open wound in history. The last video vitrine shows an excerpt of the interview with the Auschwitz and Buchenwald survivor Imre Kertész, who reflects upon the shattering of civilization by Auschwitz. Now, as I already mentioned, the video presentation is meant to be seen in conjunction with the exhibit of the over 140 items from Yale Library's collections. These items are manuscripts, pamphlets, books, photographs, documents, posters, and even 4 coins from the ghetto of Lodz, as well as the wire recorder of David Bode, the only loan in this exhibit. The majority of the items is in Yiddish, the language which was spoken by the majority of the Jews murdered in the Holocaust and of the remnant who survived. Yet the item exhibit contains materials in 10 languages, and if we count in the video excerpts, a total of 12 languages are represented. The item exhibit does not only show materials concerning the history and activities of the Fortunoff Archive, it also demonstrates that it is rooted in a long-standing Jewish tradition of documenting anti-Jewish destruction by the collection of eyewitness accounts and other documentation. Jews and other groups victimized by the Germans and their collaborators began to document their suffering already before the liberation, of course at the risk of their lives. The exhibit challenges the myth that survivors of Nazi persecutions were mostly silent in the decades after the war. The items on display prove with how much energy, dedication, and professionalism individuals and Jewish organizations set out to write their own history, attempt to bring perpetrators to justice by documenting their crimes, and to get the world to listen. Yet, as we know, most of the world failed to do so. The table cases on the ground floor tell the 20th century story of how Jews documented anti-Jewish violence and destruction of their communities from beginning of the 20th century through the big Nazi perpetrator trials in the 1960s up to the first years of the Holocaust Survivors Film Project in chronological order. In accordance with the spirit of the Fortunoff Archive and the approach to allow the victimized persons and survivors to tell their own story, Stephen and I decided not to exhibit any perpetrator documents nor to show pictures taken by perpetrators. The aftermath of a tragic pogrom in Chisinau, then Kishinev in the Russian Empire, marks the beginning of the modern history of Jewish practices to document anti-Jewish violence through the collection of eyewitness accounts. In the spring of 1903, a Christian mob in Kishinev attacked their Jewish neighbors and violently murdered 49 Jews, raped countless women and girls, mutilated 586 people, and destroyed 1,350 houses in a two-day pogrom. Unfortunately, this pogrom was nothing new. Since 1881, the Russian Empire had been shaken by waves of anti-Jewish violence. This time, however, a group of Jewish intellectuals in Odessa sent the poem Chaim Nachman Bialik to Kishinev to investigate the event and collect documentation. They gave him methodical questionnaires for survivor and eyewitnesses. Bialik fulfilled his assignment conscientiously. The notebooks in which he recorded the survivor interviews are still preserved. But instead of a factual report, he wrote a 272-line Hebrew poem in which he turns the reader into an eyewitness to the urban landscape of horror. The very beginning of the exhibit shows the extremely rare first edition of the poem in its censored version. In 1906, an uncensored version was published in the wake of the Russian Revolution under the title Be'ir HaHariga, in the city of the slaughter, under which it is still known. As many of you may know, the poem is still read by every generation speaking Hebrew or learning about Jewish history. The poem has been translated into many languages. In the exhibit, you will see a modern edition of the famous translation of the Canadian poet Abraham Klein, who rendered Be'ir HaHariga into English in 1936. Bialik's mission and mode of investigation set a precedent, as the following three sections of the exhibit show. From 1903 onwards, Jews organized themselves to investigate the waves of pogroms that ravaged the Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, especially during and in the aftermath of the First World War. In the wake of the unprecedented anti-Jewish destruction, an army of volunteer Jewish collectors went out to gather eyewitness accounts and other evidence for the Central Jewish Historical Commission. The exhibit shows how the method of collecting evidence from among the people with help of the people was deeply connected to methods of the Jewish Ethnographic Project in Eastern Europe and the establishment of YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, in 1925, an organization dedicated to the study and preservation of Jewish cultures and history. There were also many women among the volunteer collectors of pogrom documentation, but only one of them published the results of her collections herself. Rochel Feigenberg, a pogrom survivor. This one is one of her publications, which is based entirely on eyewitness accounts. The next section of the exhibit is dedicated to National Socialist Germany. There is no question that Jews were not the only ones who tried to document Nazi crimes through eyewitness accounts while these crimes were still ongoing. The book you see here is a collection of prisoner reports from various early concentration camps in Germany. The book was published by the Social Democratic Party of Germany while being in Czechoslovakia in exile in 1934. It lists the names of perpetrators and murder victims in the appendix, reflecting thus the hope of justice in a very near future. In 4 further sections, The exhibition outlines the history of the Holocaust from ghettoization, mass shootings, and death camps to liberation. The exhibit does this nearly exclusively through the testimonies of victims and survivors as well as their allies. Indeed, many of the testimonies on display in these sections were published underground or in Allied countries before the end of the war. For example, this leaflet entitled "I Cannot Remain Silent" was probably posted in English letterboxes in 1943. It was written by the Soviet Jewish journalist, writer, and war correspondent Ilya Ehrenburg. Since 1941, Ehrenburg, together with Vasily Grossman, had been collecting eyewitness accounts, letters, diaries, and official documents to document German crimes and the ongoing genocides on Soviet territory. The leaflet, the text of which was also published in newspapers, contains detailed descriptions of the Holocaust by bullets, based on accounts from survivors and witnesses. As many as 2 million Jews and hundreds of thousands of non-Jews were murdered in mass shootings by the Germans and their collaborators after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. I'm particularly proud that we can show this extremely rare pamphlet, as I acquired it myself for the collection of Yale University Library. The Allies had known about the death camps since the spring of 1942. The first reports came from survivors who had managed to escape only shortly after the first camp Chelmno began operating. Here you can see a report on Auschwitz that was published in the US in 1944. It was originally published in Polish by the Polish Underground in December 1942. It was based on eyewitness accounts by 3 former Polish prisoners and was translated into at least 8 languages before the end of the war. The small stamp in the left corner of the cover dates the acquisition of the volume by Yale University Library to September 28, 1944. In the video excerpts, we have made a point of giving survivors the opportunity to contradict the widespread naive notion of liberation and to bear witness to both their complicated situation after 1945 and their ongoing traumatization. We do the same in the item exhibit. This poem appeared in 1945 in Our Voice, Unsere Stimme, a Yiddish magazine published by survivors in the Bergen-Belsen displaced person camp between 1945 and 1947. Its author, Leib Gersh, describes the tension between a world returning to peacetime normality and the feeling of the survivors who, despite the end of the war and the arrival of spring, remained burdened with terrible sadness and shame. This is the 4th volume of the DP Camp magazine, Unsere Stimme, and you can see that its creator still had no Hebrew types, but used a spirit duplicator to print their periodical from a handwritten color-coded mastersheet. Some 250,000 Jewish survivors waited in DP camps for the opportunity to leave Europe. Despite abysmal conditions, especially during the first months after the war, the DP camps became places of cultural activity and also of early Holocaust research. Between 1945 and 1951, 150 different periodicals were published by Jewish DPs. You can see many examples in the exhibit. The early collection of testimonies after the war was not only done by the survivors themselves. In 1946, David Bode, a Jewish psychologist from the Illinois Institute of Technology, traveled to Europe to record interviews with survivors of Nazi persecutions in DP camps with a 60-pound wire recorder. Thanks to the hard work of many colleagues, we were able to borrow Boda's device. I hope you can see it in person when you visit the exhibit. On display is also Boda's book, I Did Not Interview the Dead, from the year 1948, in whose introduction he reminds us of the millions of murdered people who were unable to bear witness. He states, "The verbatim records presented in this book make uneasy reading, and yet they are not the grimmest stories that could be told. I did not interview the dead." Jewish organizations dedicated to documenting German anti-Jewish persecution and the Holocaust were founded before, during, and shortly after the war. I have already mentioned Ehrenburg and Grossmann. The exhibition presents many more, such as the Central Jewish Historical Commission in Poland, which was founded in 1944 and still exists today, albeit under a different name. On display are rather rare publications of this commission from the years 1945 to 1948. Among them is the testimony of Rudolf Rieder, who was one of the only two known survivors of the Belzec death camp. We show the publication closed in the exhibit, but here in this context, I can show you two of its pages, which demonstrate how detailed Rieder's testimony was. Another Jewish historical commission, which featured prominently in the exhibit, is the already mentioned Central Historical Commission of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in the American Zone. This commission sat in Munich. It was an important pioneer of early Holocaust research. It not only feverishly collected eyewitness accounts, documents, songs, photographs, language, and other sources, but also published the historical journal Von letzten Groben, From the Last Extermination, from 1946 to 1948, which you can see here. And here again, you can see a stamp showing that Yale Library acquired this issue in 1947. I already mentioned the poster competition organized by the Historical Commission in Munich in the beginning of my talk. The poster, which gained second place, is displayed in the other round case of the mezzanine. It was designed by the survivor Pinchas Schuldenrein and perfectly reflects the Jewish tradition of documenting and commemorating destruction from the biblical book Eicha, Lamentations, to the Historical Commission. The poster calls out to the viewer in Hebrew and Yiddish, "Remember what Amalek did to you, collect and record." Of course, the exhibition also shows the legal dimension of the testimonies of survivors from the Schwarzbad trial in the 1920s, to the Nuremberg trials, to the Dachau and Buchenwald trial, to the Eichmann trial in 1961, and the first Frankfurt Auschwitz trial from 1963 to 1965. I will conclude here with the publication of the Viennese-born Auschwitz survivor Hermann Langbein. He was instrumental, you can see him here. He was instrumental in the realization of the Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt from 1963 to 1965 and the invitation of over 200 survivors as witnesses. Hermann Langbein himself testified at the Auschwitz trial. In the following decades, he played a central role in the establishment of eyewitness programs at schools in Austria and Germany, which further emphasize the necessity of bearing witness. An end is also approaching for this form of living testimony. This should remind us to look for alternative forms of active engagement with the Holocaust. To conclude, I would like to stress again that in the first person is the product of close collaboration, shared expertise, and graciousness. Stephen and I are so grateful to everyone who has made the exhibition possible and to everyone who shows interest in it. Our most heartfelt gratitude goes, however, to the survivors and their families who left with their testimonies this legacy to the world. Many thanks for listening.